When I was a young teenager, my life was pretty interesting. It was much more exciting than my seemingly lackluster life now in my mid-20s. I was 13. Damn, I thought I was hot shit, always keeping up with the latest trends on MTV or any other form of trendy media that young teens seem to take as absolute truth and see as the most important thing in life. My parents would tell me that when I got older, that stuff wouldn't matter anymore and that I should concentrate on more constructive forms of entertainment and time consumption. I, of course, being 13, would tell them that they didn't understand what it was like to be young anymore and that they were too old and out of touch with reality to understand my friends and me. Keep in mind it was the late 1990s, 1999 to be exact. My friends and I were all punk kids, skaters, bent on rebelling from authority, listening to rock and rap, and doing just about the opposite of whatever our parents told us to do. That being said, one day in my 7th grade art class at John Adams Junior High, yes, junior high, before it was revamped to be a middle school a few years later, something happened that would open my eyes to what, at the time, seemed like a whole new world of cool. One of my friends in the class with me was Ethan. Ethan came up to me and sat down in the chair to my right. When the teacher turned away, Ethan told me to look and pointed down at his hand. He had pulled out a bag with something green in it. I asked him what it was, and he answered that it was called Purple Kush. I must have given him a confused look, because shortly after he said, "It's weed, man. Some real chronic shit. The dankest around." He said it so loud that the teacher almost heard him. She looked up and gave him the evil eye. He shoved it back in his pocket and told me to come find him at lunch, and he would tell me more about it. Once again, being 13, I was super intrigued at that point, so I agreed that I would come find him during our lunch period since we both had second lunch. Ethan had been held back a few times, so I'm pretty sure he was 15. Since he was older, he also hung out with the older kids in 9th grade and even some kids in high school since he had an older brother in 10th grade. Ethan's older brother was pretty much the drug kingpin of the high school he attended right down the road from our junior high. I didn't know this before that day. When I met back up with Ethan at lunch, he opened my eyes to a subject that I'd previously known nothing about besides what I'd heard in Dare and from other forms of drugs or bad public service announcements from celebrities in the 90s. Look it up, there were a lot of those. Anyway, he once again pulled out the bag, careful that no teachers were around to see it. He opened it up and told me to smell it. The pungent aroma resembling that of a skunk almost physically knocked me back. I coughed and proclaimed that I did not like the smell at all and wondered how anyone could smoke anything that smelled like that before it was even burned. He laughed at me and told me that I had a lot to learn. Okay, at this point in time, I was torn because I'd always thought that drugs were bad, and I knew that even though marijuana was probably the least offensive and most socially accepted of drugs, I still wasn't sure about it. I had, however, become okay with the idea of partying and drinking by that age. A few friends and I had snuck into his parents' liquor cabinet once and got so drunk that we were all puking by the end of the night. We told stories about it at school and even became legends for being one of the first groups of friends our age to actually get drunk, and at 13, that was cool. I was popular. My friends were popular. And everything I did had to look cool to my fellow classmates, either while they witnessed it or when we told stories of it in the weeks that followed. Needless to say, we were running out of ways to stay cool and new things to try that everyone our age would desire to be the next to try. Okay, back to my conversation with Ethan. After some back and forth between him schooling me on weed and convincing me that it's no worse than alcohol, and me telling him how I wasn't sure of it and I was still an athlete and didn't want to ruin my lungs by smoking it, he finally convinced me to give him $10. He in return gave me a dime bag of what he called the dankest of the dank. He assured me that after I smoked this I would be back for more, not because I became addicted, but because it was fun and would lead to crazy stories and shenanigans to tell all of our classmates about. In turn, it would even make me more popular. This was really the selling point in the whole matter. Like I said before, popularity was everything at this point in my life, as well as my friends' lives. Therefore, anything that would make us more popular was a must. The next class period, I invited over my best friend David and told him about the plan. He would come over that night, and since it was a Friday, he could spend the night at my house. When it got to be 1 a.m. and my parents were definitely asleep, we would sneak outside and smoke. Everything was falling into place perfectly that night when David's mom called my house. My mom answered. I couldn't tell what they were talking about, but I knew it was serious. I was worried that somehow David's mom had overheard him talking of our plans to someone on the phone after school before he'd come over. My mom hung up the phone and turned to David and me. "David, honey, your mom is coming to get you." I asked why, and my mom told me that it was personal and that it wasn't any of my business and to stop being nosy. I was bummed out. Whatever had happened couldn't have been so important that David had to leave and ruin our whole night that we had planned. David's mom arrived, and David apologized and told me that he'd let me know what the deal was. Well, it turns out his grandmother had passed away. He called me from his mom's cell phone on the way to the hospital to tell me, and even though I was still annoyed, I understood why he had to leave. I had all but given up on having a crazy fun night and had given in to the fact that I was going to be spending the night sober, listening to CDs with the TV on mute because that was cool. Just then, my phone rang. It was my neighbor, Andrew. Andrew was actually a year younger than me and went to Catholic school, but he was my neighbor, so we were friends. He and I were known for getting into trouble in recent years, blowing up mailboxes with fireworks and gasoline and crazy stuff like that. I was convinced Andrew was a pyromaniac. Yet, when we got together, I admit I seemed like a bit of a pyro myself. He asked me if I wanted to hang out, and I suddenly had new hope. I had found a replacement for David in my night of self-discovery. Andrew came over and we looked on the internet for how to make a bong out of household objects. We ended up making what's called a hookah out of a honey bear, some rubber tubing, an ink pen, and a metal socket from Dad's toolbox. Andrew had about 5 lighters in his pocket at all times, so lighting it wouldn't be a problem. Even though Andrew was a year younger than me, I quickly sold him on the idea once he realized it involved lighting something on fire. He told his parents he was spending the night, and we were set. As we sat in my room listening to Limp Bizkit's $3 Bill Y'all CD, we got pumped up while waiting for my parents to fall asleep. We were ready, or so we thought. We had everything, but nothing we packed into Andrew's backpack could have helped prepare us for what was to come. In our relatively rich neighborhood, there was a lot of space between houses and therefore a lot of room to hide out. We picked a spot where we would sometimes go to sled when it snowed. It was up on a hill, out of the way, with plenty of trees on site. The closest houses were down the hill from us, so the people in them couldn't see the lighter flick as long as we stayed behind the trees. 1 a.m. arrived. We snuck out, careful not to make any noise and wake my parents. Once we were out, we were downright giddy with excitement. We made the long walk to the spot, set up the hookah, and packed the weed in the socket, and did something I've wished that I had never done. There was no way that we could have known what was coming next. We were just kids trying to have a little bit of crazy fun, but it all went terribly wrong. The hookah we made was actually made so 2 people could smoke it at the same time. We each grabbed a hose, and once positioned behind the trees, Andrew pulled out one of his many lighters. He had tweaked it so the flame was about 3 times the size of a normal lighter's flame. At first, the shock of the giant flame made us both laugh, so he let off the gas and turned it down just a bit. He lit it again, and we began to smoke. The honey bear filled up with the thick gray smoke as we both inhaled on our designated tubes. Andrew stopped first, and a second later I did too. We both held it in, trying to outlast one another. Everything was always a competition with Andrew and me. We started to cough simultaneously and laughed while still coughing. We'd both been drunk before, yet neither of us had ever smoked pot, so we really weren't sure what to expect. Even if we did, this was no ordinary weed. We repeated the steps a few more times until almost all the weed had turned to ash. At first, it was amazing. We were laughing hysterically, followed by both becoming totally quiet. This was due to me mentioning that we needed to be quiet so the neighbors and any of the surrounding houses didn't catch us. At this point, we were both pretty stoned and had become quite paranoid. This is where the story gets really bizarre. As we were taking in our surroundings, freshly stoned and interested in exploring our high, Andrew heard something. A rustling, coming from some bushes about 20 feet away. We both got thoroughly freaked out, but then calmed down and assumed it was an animal. Then Andrew asked me a question. "Did you see that?" he asked me. "See what, man? You're just paranoid, dude. There's nothing out here but us and maybe some animals." Andrew looked very serious and said, "No, man, it looked like a person." I told him now I knew he was definitely seeing things. His attitude had completely changed, though. "No, man, I'm fucking serious. It looked like a person. I couldn't see any of the features, though. Almost like a shadow." "Okay, man, now you're seeing shadow people? You're definitely high. It's the weed, man. Just calm down." Just then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it too. The same thing Andrew just described. A figure, shadow-like in appearance, darted from one tree to behind another. At this point, I started to freak out too. "Okay, man, that time I saw it too," I said. "You saw that shit too?" Andrew asked. "I told you! I fucking told you! I knew I saw something!" I forgot to mention before, Andrew and I were the only kids that lived here in our neighborhood, and it was a good 3 miles away from any other kids. We started to feel like we were being closed in on from all directions, occasionally seeing these shadow people out of the corners of our eyes. It was like they wouldn't move if we were looking right at them, but as soon as we would turn away, they would come closer. The only way I can think to describe it better is the ghost on Super Mario World. If you look one way, they hide. Then the ones behind you come towards you. Then you turn towards those, they stop, but the other ones come towards you. Either way, eventually they got closer and closer. We finally decided to get the hell out of there. We were up on a hill, so we decided the best and fastest way was down the hill, towards the houses. I'm not sure what happened to Andrew next, and it haunts me to this day. As we were running down the hill, I was in front and he was behind me. I was running as hard as I could when the feeling of being watched was replaced with the feeling of being alone. Right before arriving at my house, I stopped running and turned around. Andrew was gone. No longer afraid of getting caught and more scared of getting in trouble for not knowing where Andrew was, not to mention being worried for my friend's safety, I started yelling out his name at the top of my lungs. I was right outside my house by this point. We'd been so close to the safety of being home. Yet we forfeited that safety, all to go out and smoke some weed. As I was yelling Andrew's name outside my house, my ears started ringing. Loud. Like, really loud. I could almost feel my heart beating in my throat, and then my head started pounding. I remember hitting the ground, holding my head and screaming. I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital. My mom and dad were standing over me. They smiled and hugged me when I became conscious again. Apparently that weed that we had smoked was laced with some kind of designer drug. Not much is known about it. When I explained to them what happened, they told me that it was all a side effect from the drug, that we had suffered from hallucinations and blah blah blah. There was one problem though. Andrew was still missing. Nobody believed that the shadow people we saw were anything but hallucinations, yet nobody could explain Andrew's disappearance. There were search parties dispatched, police investigations. I was bombarded with interrogation techniques over and over. I didn't know what happened to Andrew. Nobody believed me. Over time, they gave up looking for him. The official report said that Andrew was a runaway teenager who was troubled and on drugs. That wasn't the case. His parents blame me for his disappearance. They think that if he did in fact run away, it was because the chemical-laced weed I'd smoked with him had driven him insane and make him do so. Ethan and his older brother were both arrested on charges of selling tainted marijuana to minors, but they posted bail and eventually were let off with no more than a slap on the wrist. Some community service, a few months of home confinement, and that's it. My family moved shortly after that. We had to. I was forever labeled a bad influence, and some even called me a murderer, even though there was never a body found. Our small community was torn to shreds by this disappearance, and especially with no explanation, there was really no closure for anyone. To this day, I think about that night and wondering what happened to Andrew. Wondering how 1 second he was right behind me and then gone the next. You'll never catch me smoking anything these days. I stay inside at night too. On occasion, though, I've looked out the window at night, and sometimes, right before I look away, I swear I can see something outside. Just a glimpse, though, out of the corner of my eye.